Yesterday, we heard from a number of startup companies that were integrating technology into health solutions as their business model. Now we're going to hear from Stephen Collens, who's the CEO of Matter, and he's going to talk about some of the best uses of technology that he's seen in the life sciences. So Matter is a health technology incubator based in Chicago. They work with over 200 startups, over 10 universities, over 50 companies. So he's certainly got a front seat in seeing the best uses of technology in healthcare. And in addition, Stephen helped found ConstantWellness.com. So another perspective, which is enabled to give patients control over their healthcare data for their use and in partnership with their providers. So really interesting perspectives I know that Stephen's going to share with us, so please help me welcome Stephen Collens from Well.
Morning. So Constant Wellness, by the way, doesn't exist, just to clarify. It was a complete failure of a startup. I've made probably every mistake that you should make if you don't know what you're doing when you're trying to build a startup. This was about 10 years ago. I'd like to think I could do it better, but just in case anybody's Googling like ConstantWellness.com to try to find how they can get their patient records more in tune with their providers, it doesn't exist. So that said, I am the CEO of Matter, the healthcare technology incubator and innovation hub based in Chicago. And I was asked to talk about technology trends and technologies that are relevant to the healthcare and life sciences industry. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna pick up on some of the themes that we just heard from Christy. I think I'm gonna touch a little bit on the question that David asked about integration of tech and the kind of life sciences business and how that's going. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about some macro trends that we're seeing and why this is really the most interesting time ever for technology and innovation and entrepreneurship in the healthcare industry. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of entrepreneurs that I think are really doing particularly interesting things, and then I'm going to talk about kind of the business of it and some of the innovation and where we see that evolving. So with that, that didn't work, so let's try this one. This is a picture of digital health investment over the last 8 years. You can see from a venture capital perspective, this has become a really interesting place to deploy capital. We've seen about a 10x growth in venture capital investment into digital health over the last 8 years. This compares to about a 2.5 times increase in the venture capital sector overall. So we see about a 4x multiple of digital health growing faster than kind of venture capital investment overall. So why is that? There are three kind of big macro trends that I think we're really seeing driving this level of investment, driving the increase in entrepreneurship, driving the increase in the level of activity in healthcare-related technology entrepreneurship. So first of all, technology is changing everything. Christy gave a nice presentation on that. It is affecting every industry, it's affecting every sector, it's affecting every part of our lives. This gives you one graph looking at the number of connected devices in the world. The graph is Cisco's version of it. It doesn't really matter which one of these sources you take. They all have graphs that look very similar. They just have a different scale and different definitions. But this is due to advances in wireless, advances in battery technology, advances in cloud, advances in the miniaturization of things. And this kind of Internet of Things we see as a huge trend driving innovation across all sectors. In healthcare, it creates all sorts of interesting possibilities to connect with people outside of the hospital, to take data that's being generated inside the hospital and do more interesting things with it. And I'll touch on all of that more in a moment. Second, there's a lot of data. Christy mentioned and David echoed, 30% of all of the data that's in storage is now healthcare data. That's unbelievable if you if you think about it. Especially since about 10 years ago, this is what a clinical data warehouse really used to look like. This was basically state of the art. You look at the penetration of electronic medical records, 10 years ago they were kind of a curiosity. They were more of an anomaly. Today in the acute care setting, they're ubiquitous. In the ambulatory setting, they're almost ubiquitous. There are other settings that are still catching up, like senior living, that are catching up quickly. But really, the electronic medical record has become the way that clinical data is stored. The systems are a little kludgy. The data is siloed. There leaves a lot to be desired. But already, the fact is, when you take all that data out of file folders and you digitize it, you can analyze it, and you can determine what kinds of treatments are working and what isn't, and what's interacting with each other, and you can follow the patient journey and learn an enormous amount about patients by following them over time, by analyzing huge cohorts over time. You can do things that just weren't even conceivable when all that data was stored in a paper format. And third, the business of healthcare is really in flux. It's in transition. We've always had a fee-for-service system, kind of this cost-plus model where the economics of healthcare are tied to the amount of activity that is done and not really connected to the outcomes that are delivered. And we're moving towards a value-based care environment. We're not moving at Indy 500 speeds, but we are moving, and we're continuing ever so slowly to kind of make progress. Depending on who you ask, this is either a 30-year transition or a 10-year transition. We're either in the middle of it or in the beginning of it. It doesn't, for this purpose, really matter. We are moving in that direction, and that creates an enormous kind of undercurrent of disruption in the economics of healthcare that directly affects providers, it directly affects payers, and it indirectly affects anyone who's selling anything into the healthcare system that sees a future of what healthcare economics looks like that is quite different from what it looks like today, where payment will be tied to value that's created, to outcomes that are delivered. When you take these three trends, you take kind of the general trend that technology is changing everything in the world at a pretty increasingly fast rate. You take these two things that are pretty specific to healthcare, the changing business model, the kind of relatively recent digitization of clinical data, and what you get is an incredibly dynamic time for entrepreneurship and for investment in new healthcare technologies, in digital solutions that can really affect health and healthcare and wellness. So at a very high level, what we see is that today we have really a reactive healthcare system. This is what we've always had. When you have a problem, you go to the doctor. When you have a more serious problem, you go to the hospital. You go someplace when there's a problem, and the healthcare system generally reacts to that problem and tries to fix it, and we're pretty good at that. A lot of the technologies that are being developed are helping us evolve the healthcare system to become one that is proactive, that's predictive, that's personalized, so that the healthcare system will, in the future, come to you before you even know that you have a problem. You know, Christy touched on the patient really driving healthcare, and we see that more and more and more. I think the next level beyond that is that the patient won't even know that he or she is driving healthcare, but there is the healthcare system writ large will understand what's going on with you before you even experience any symptoms or know that you're experiencing any symptoms, and can trigger healthcare interventions at points in time to stave off illness in ways that really aren't possible today. So I'll tell you a story. This is Larry Kaczynski. He is a gastroenterologist, practices outside of Chicago. He's built a fairly large gastroenterology practice. He sees a lot of patients with inflammatory bowel disease, and he became quite frustrated over time that he would see his patients generally once a year, He'd get a feel for how they're doing, how well they're managing their disease, what the complications are, what their lifestyle's like, what the issues might be, and then they would disappear. And he would have no contact with them until their next kind of regularly scheduled visit, or he'd get a call from the hospital sometimes saying, hey, one of your patients is here and they're not doing so well. They might need surgery, you might want to come in and take a look. So he felt like his patients were sort of like submarines. They popped up out of the ocean into his office. He got a feel for them. He could see them. He could touch them. He could understand how they're doing. And then they disappear under the ocean, and he'd have no way to interact with them in between these visits. And he felt like that impeded his ability as a gastroenterologist to really effectively manage care with his patients. So he felt like he wanted the equivalent of a sonar system that would ping his patients on a regular basis. He created a company called Sonar MD. He took a well-validated survey instrument that gastroenterologists use called the Crohn's Disease Activity Index, adapted it, pulled about 5 or 6 questions from it, and created a pretty simple system. It sends a text message to his patients once a month. They get a link. They click on the link, answer 5 or 6 questions. That data goes into his system. He built an algorithm, can analyze that data against some baselines for each of the patients in his system. And what he found, he then ran a study with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois with several hundred patients. And he found that just that simple pinging of patients, generating that data, it would go through his system and stratify. And so his office would see a screen every day saying, these are the patients that are most at risk. They would then reach out to those patients proactively and say, why don't you come in for a visit? Or give them a call and say, what's going on? It seems like your Crohn's isn't as well controlled. What can we do about that? So he ran this study with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois and found that patients on this system had 50% fewer hospitalizations than patients not on this system, that overall the cost of managing these patients went down more than 20%. Overall, the use of kind of second and third line drugs, a lot of the newer biologics, went up significantly because he had a much clearer read from his patients of which ones weren't being managed well in those first and second line therapies, and so needed to kind of step it up to the next level. Blue Cross Blue Shield now pays gastroenterologists in Illinois to use this system. So if you're a gastroenterologist, you put your patients on this tool, you get paid every month per patient to use this system because overall it reduces the cost of care. Excuse me. I'm going to come back to that last bit because I think it's actually the most important part of the innovation that Dr. Kaczynski has developed. All right, second example I'll give you is a guy named Corey McCann. He's an MD, PhD, started out as a scientist, had a career in venture capital, mostly biotech and pharma. And in probably 6-7 years ago, in some of the early days of digital health, he became really fascinated by 2 questions. So one question was, could you use software to treat conditions? And clearly there are ways to generate improved clinical outcomes with validated clinical endpoints to do studies on things that aren't necessarily drugs, cognitive behavioral therapy being one of them. You can prove that that works, that it actually changes the course of somebody's disease, that makes them better. So he wondered, could software do the same thing? So he started exploring that. And the second thing that he became really fascinated by was there were all of these digital health solutions starting to emerge. And he didn't understand the business models behind most of these solutions. How are they going to make money? Who's going to use them? How are they going to fit into the architecture of the healthcare industry that he was familiar with? So he created a company called Pear Therapeutics and really started with a business model. And he started with the pharma business model, which is one that he was particularly intimately familiar with. And he said his thesis was that he could drugify software, that he could take a piece of software, he could work with the FDA, run it through a clinical development program, and out the other end would come an FDA-approved therapeutic that was entirely software-based. So about a year ago, got approval for this first digital therapeutic. He ran randomized control trials, ran it through a whole FDA clinical development program. They ran it through technically a device pathway that they created, but functionally it acts more like a drug. It has an indication. It's indicated for non-opioid substance abuse, treatment of non-opioid substance abuse disorder. It has indications. It has contraindications. It's indicated for concomitant therapy with the standard of care therapeutic. More recently this year, he got reimbursement from a number of payers for this solution. Announced quite recently that Novartis will be the commercial partner when he goes to market with this product, which is called Reset. And the way it's going to work is doctors will prescribe it to their patients. Patients will download it. They'll use it at their convenience. The insurance companies will pay for it. It will work kind of just like a drug. And what's particularly interesting about this, other than the fact that having worked in pharma for a while, I just think it's fascinating, is that the software isn't really unique. I mean, he has a bunch of patents around the asset of the way of using software in this way, but there's nothing like revolutionarily breakthrough about the software. What is revolutionarily breakthrough is the business model that he developed for this. And similarly, with Larry Kaczynski that we talked about a minute ago, there's nothing terribly sophisticated about the way that he's texting people. You click on a link. The survey questions that he used are from a well-validated tool that's been out in use for decades. The algorithm he built, it's an algorithm. There's nothing that special about it. But the business model is really interesting. He has now Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois paying for these, paying doctors to use this solution because cost goes down and outcomes improve. And the fact is, and where a lot of entrepreneurs get tripped up, is that the business of healthcare is really, really weird. It just doesn't work the way that normal industries work. And so in almost every other industry, if you create a product that solves a problem, somebody will pay for it. And it's possible they won't pay enough for it to make a viable business. It's possible not enough people will pay for it to make a viable business. All sorts of reasons why businesses fail. But the fact is, if you create a product that clearly solves a problem, somebody will pay for it. And in healthcare, that equation breaks down. It doesn't work. It is very easy to create products that clearly solve problems, that clearly improve health outcomes. But because of the way the reimbursement system works, because of the way the economics of healthcare works, because of all of the intermediaries, because of the way the system works, somebody won't pay for it because they can neither make more money from it nor can they save money, and it just doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. And this is where we see entrepreneurs being tripped up time and time again, and this is where I think we're going to start seeing, as the digital health industry, if you want to call it that, begins to mature. It's not mature, but it's more mature than it was 10 years ago. I think we're going to see a lot more innovation around business models, and business models that really integrate with the healthcare system, that are really based on existing workflow, existing reimbursement, and aren't trying to do something that is completely out of line or out of bounds from the way the healthcare system really operates today. So at Matter, just to wrap up, we believe collaboration is the best way that this is going to happen. We believe that entrepreneurs need the established industry in order to understand what problems to solve and how to solve those problems, importantly, how to solve those problems. And we believe that when entrepreneurs are working together with the industry, that is going to be the best and most effective way to accelerate innovation and advance care and improve lives. We generally do three things at Matter. We're a startup incubator, we are a nexus for the healthcare community, and we're a corporate innovation accelerator. And our thesis is that the only way to really do this with any scale is when you have big established corporations and hospitals deeply engaged and working directly with startups and a broader community to figure out how to develop those solutions. We work with about 200 startup companies. They span the gamut of stage, of size, of type of technology, of geography. We have about 70 corporate and institutional partners, including a lot of pharma companies, hospitals, insurance companies, device, diagnostics, pharmacy, IT, kind of across the spectrum of the healthcare industry. And we've been around for coming up on 4 years now. We are organized as a not-for-profit entity, really designed to build collaborations, to build community, and to accelerate the kinds of both technological and business innovations that can really drive improvements in health and healthcare. Thank you very much, and be happy to answer any questions.
In your collaborative model, are you including higher education?
Yes. So far not Purdue, Butler, or IU, but maybe. So we have partnerships with 5 or 6 universities. Notre Dame is one of them. We tend to work with universities in 2 broad areas. So one is with their tech transfer offices. We've found that most tech transfer offices are pretty good at, they're pretty good at identifying assets. They're not terrific at commercializing those assets or really understanding what is the commercial trajectory, what can that look like for those technologies, whether it's a therapeutic, a piece of software, a medical device, or anything else. So one of our kind of core programs is working with universities that have assets that they've identified where they're looking for help fleshing out kind of what does the development path look like, what is the development program, how do we get to the point where we can raise outside capital, should this be a standalone company or not. So we do a lot of work in that area. The second area where we're doing more and more tends to be with business schools. So we just launched a class with Kellogg, with Northwestern's business school, where the first few weeks of the class are really an introduction to the pharma business model, to the device business model, to the digital health business model. But most of the class is teams of students working directly with some of the startup and growth stage companies that are members of Matter on specific projects with mentorship and oversight from people who have a lot of experience in this arena to really help people who have a theoretical interest in healthcare entrepreneurship understand exactly what it takes to build these businesses, how hard it is, and why they should ultimately, hopefully, all go do it. Yes?
Hey, Stephen. Brian Stemme from BioCrossroads. Thanks for being here. The question I had related to the incubator that you're running, I've read a lot about big pharma and big device companies working with incubators and being there to support them. Can you talk about how it sounds like you've incorporated payers in the Chicago area or from nearby areas into your ecosystem and how they're helping you?
Yeah, so on the payer side, we have 3 large payers we work with. One is Chicago-based Healthcare Service Corporation. They run Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Texas, Montana, Oklahoma, and something else. New Mexico. And then Humana and Cigna are the other 2, more the national plans. So one of the things, actually just a few days ago, we launched a challenge program with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, specifically around health equity. They're looking for technologies, for entrepreneurial intervention solutions that can help close some of the gaps in health equity. And they're kind of open to anything. They realize they've been kind of banging their head into this for a while, as I think lots of other people have. Some of the statistics just from Chicago are pretty striking. There's one neighborhood about 3 miles from downtown, and if you grow up in that neighborhood, your life expectancy is 16 years shorter than if you grow up in one of the wealthier neighborhoods downtown. And it's been like that for as long as anyone can remember. And so the notion is, can we kind of focus more entrepreneurs on solutions that might help kind of close some of the health disparities? We're working with them as well as with Humana and Cigna on generally 2 areas. One is aligning entrepreneurs to areas that are interesting to them as companies. And the second is building their own internal innovation capabilities, which we spend more and more time on. We find that big companies generally want to figure out how to be a little bit more nimble. They want their kind of executives and managers to understand more about how digital health can help advance their businesses. They want to understand a little bit more kind of how other entrepreneurial organizations make decisions, which is just different than the way that they may operate. And so we have different initiatives going with all 3 of them right now in both of those areas. Yes?
So keeping with the topic of collaborators, so we talked about the business side and MBA students, so on, talked about the payers. But both of the examples you gave us were actually physicians that came up with the innovation. Have you thought about going to medical schools and maybe partnering with resident programs where you've got students that have grown up in this digital age and they are confronted with this, whatever problem it is of, barriers to digitalization or whatever. And maybe that's a place where you could either learn new innovation or even teach some of these things you're coming up with to give them the tools to do things differently.
Yeah, that is such a great point. I hadn't thought about the fact that I gave 2 examples and they were both MDs who had developed these solutions. Many, if not most, of the entrepreneurs we work with at Matter have some pretty deep healthcare experience. They're physicians, they're other clinical professionals, they are coming out of industry, many years of different parts of the industry of understanding kind of where are the problems and how does the industry actually work. So we tend to love physician entrepreneurs. There aren't enough of them. We have a program we launched this year with Northwestern's medical school with Feinberg. And it's for med students, not for residents. But the thesis was, and it's proving out, that there are a growing number of med students that have an interest in entrepreneurship and want to understand, what would it take? They probably want to be doctors because they're going to med school, but they're curious about entrepreneurship. And so it's a pretty straightforward program so far. We'll see how it evolves. But it's basically a monthly kind of lecture series that's only open to medical students. It is basically only taught by MDs and has kind of all range of topics related to the business of healthcare and in particular healthcare entrepreneurship. I think it's an area where we can and should and hopefully will do a lot more over time. As I think, by definition, somebody who's going through the torture of medical school is incredibly passionate about healthcare and solving health problems. And we have seen, and the American Medical Association is one of our partners as well, we've seen physician satisfaction rates decreasing significantly over time as the business of healthcare kind of changes in different ways. And so creating more outlets, interesting opportunities, places for doctors to flex their creativity as they evolve is, I think, a really important thing that we will do more of. So thank you. There's a question from Liven. Are you currently working with any Indiana companies? The answer is yes. I could just stop there because unfortunately the I would have to remember which ones they are. So we have, I mentioned we have 200, it's actually now close to 220 startup companies. There are some of those from Indiana, and I'm embarrassed that I do not remember which ones they were, and I didn't even think to look that up before I came down here. So, so the answer is yes. On the large corporate side, we're working with Roche. So we have a program with Roche that we're going to be sort of kicking off, hopefully in the next few weeks. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'll be around for the rest of the day in case anyone wants to continue the conversation.